We're going to invite a couple of other panelists to the stage to convene our third panel discussion. So the first is Nathan. Nathan is the co-founder and CEO of Scroll, a data management security and storage company that is advancing present-day blockchain technology. Nathan's vision of accessing files from a connected file system platform quickly scaled to management of big data by developing a blockchain network, specifically for data storage. So welcome, Nathan.
And we also have Ariel Telesmanek, who works as the Director of Emerging Technologies at Scroll, a data management, security, and storage company that is advancing present-day blockchain technology. She ensures the end-to-end flow of data within the Scroll ecosystem is sustainable and responsive to preventing major inefficiencies and lack of risk management in today's data solutions. Welcome, all of you. And Martine, of course.
Well, again, no, that's fine, that's fine. I'm flexible. I like this. I like looking at things from different perspectives. Thank you, Kenzo, for that, as you said, intense whirlwind, to see how complex this can easily get. And Nathan, you and Ariel have to deal with that degree of complexity, and probably even more when you're working in Scroll. I know that Scroll uses Hyperledger. In fact, that's how we got connected. Hyperledger, Yale's an associate member since this year of the Hyperledger project, and they said, you know, you have to talk to these guys, and they're in New Haven. So this is a great thing to see that we have one of the Hyperledger golden projects here in town, which might be dangerous because then they're going to start finding you in your office. You're literally a district, right? So
yeah, we're literally right down the road. It's pretty awesome.
So let's hear a bit about Scroll, and I want to eventually kind of look back into understanding the different ecosystems and why you picked Hyperledger, and then kind of connecting it back with Kenzo, Kenzo's talk. So either of you can explain some of the projects that you guys are running and how you're using.
Sure. So for the college students in the room and stuff like that, and people that want to build really cool stuff. So we basically started on this really cool hypothesis about 2 years ago that we can move data peer-to-peer without involving a third party at all, and we just want to totally get rid of it because, you know, nobody likes being monitored and stuff like that. So we developed a really simple peer-to-peer platform, and it was called Slide Drive. So the premise of Slide Drive was let's get rid of file size limits. Let's not make it just basically an FTP function, but like let's make this thing so that way it could be expansive and we could keep growing it with more and more devices and just make this huge expansive network of just peer-to-peer communicators without involving third-party cloud storage. So anyway, that eventually evolved into why don't we involve like a DLT. So we decided to involve a DLT, like a blockchain ledger. So the main reason why we decided to do that is it just accentuates the value of a completely decentralized platform. And we kept growing the platform and getting it bigger and bigger. So we actually deployed our first main network yesterday. And wow, yeah, it was really cool. Long way coming. But
this is to share files.
Thank you. It didn't bug out. I was really happy. But anyway, in terms of sharing files, we came up with a couple of roadblocks come into play with blockchain in general. So first one is how do you scale this ever-growing system, especially if you want to serve businesses like what we do. So we came to the conclusion that while there does need to be a immutability factor with blockchain technology, we do need some sort of level of mutability in order to either remove things from the ledger or introduce new things. So we came up with the concept of mutable blocks, immutable smart contracts. So that way we can reference whenever a transaction is moved, but at the same time we can remove a block from the blockchain if anything has gone wrong or anything has essential issue with it. So that way we can store data on chain and make it much more efficient for businesses while increasing scalability. So how we work with Hyperledger is we don't entirely use just Hyperledger's technology, we mesh the two. So right now we're working with Hyperledger Burrow and Sawtooth, and we integrate that into our existing technology as more of an easier way to deploy the framework and make it more easier to use for businesses, since that's what Hyperledger is really bent around doing.
Can you give us a simple analogy so we understand what makes Slide Drive as a file sharing platform different to other file sharing platforms? And an example of that would be, I don't know, BitTorrent, for example,
sure, yeah,
or other ones. And then that's still kind of like a peer-to-peer or yeah. Not. And where does it fit within enterprises? And then when you talked about Hyperledger, Sawtooth, and Burrow, maybe you can expand a bit on what those ecosystems are within Hyperledger.
Sure. So in terms of Slide Drive in comparison to BitTorrent, essentially when you're using BitTorrent, you're still involving in some way in general. You're storing data on another reference server. So they're categorizing information, they're keeping track of it, and regardless, even though like there's a seeding, reseeding process with files, with Slide Drive, it's just simply a movement of files between two systems. So what we're doing is we're categorizing where all the data is moved on Slide Drive through the ledger, and then that way you can see where it's on what devices, or where it's going to be, where it has been. So it's a really good data management tool, and as Scroll is expanding, we're moving into logistics and supply chain related technologies.
And a company would want to incorporate this for managing all of the files of the company?
Yes. So the intent is for us to completely create a new type of RDB, like a relational database, and make it more bent about making the blockchain as a form of a DB rather than just using it as a DLT as it is. So with relational databases and stuff like that tend to be more centralized, tend to be more in one place. So like back to the original mission, the original idea was we just want to completely try to make it so there's not one centralized source for where data goes. So that way we can allow for more, better cryptographic methodologies, so that way we can secure data better. So while not necessarily has to do with like cryptography and stuff like that from centralized servers, a lot of these things are insider attacks and stuff like that. By decentralizing that information as best as we can prevent the case in which that could happen, like one centralized insider attack.
It brings also a layer of security for enterprises that would use this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ariel, and I understand that that's an explanation of Slide Drive, but you guys have a different product. So your company is called Solutech, but Slide Drive is one product, and then there's Scroll, and there's one particular project that you're working that is applicable for managing supply chains, which is a very interesting topic in terms of sustainability. So if you could explain a bit of that,
yeah.
I think we're going to have a lot of interest.
I can kind of give you guys a little bit more of an overview of each of the products and the purpose that they are created for, and then the interactions within the actual end users. So Slide Drive, as Nate was saying, is simple peer-to-peer networking, but we authenticate the two users and make sure that the connection stream between the two file systems are accessible for pushing and pulling of files. So you think about it, Dropbox is still a mediary, so you need to plan to put that actual file onto Dropbox. And yeah, you're paying for the security, of course. So most peer-to-peer or torrenting sites they're not very secure. So that's the idea of the authentication server for Slide Drive. You can think about Slide Drive as mostly the preparedness of having your information on hand, no matter which device is at hand. So you can think about it as grabbing your class and you're grabbing a file from your friend's computer to your own device. That's what Slide Drive is meant for. And we think that's important that you own your own information. Centralized servers are accountable for your own information, but mostly the identity of it is that they own that information. So startups, your research projects, anything on Google Cloud or Dropbox is not actually owned by you anymore. So we think that we're putting that ownership back into the hands of the users. Those are the two pinnacles of Slide Drive. Scroll is really the blockchain project that we're all here to talk about, and it's a very unique usage of blockchain fundamentals. as Carlos and Kenzo, right? As Carlos and Kenzo was going over mutability and distribution of data. So think of, and even just the auditing, the auditing environment of blockchain. So think about the how data is managed today. You are using centralized servers, and everything is basically a battle of the congestion within those servers. Multiple companies are being serviced by one centralized provider, and that itself is not as manageable or configurable. So we like to think that with blockchain, everyone has a dedicated instance, and they have the amount of information that they need to comb through to get that information. So the actual efficiency in accessing your data is completely expedited. And of course, there's stress testing going on currently, but we do have one client, and they're actually holding 3D files, and their IT team, the IT team, the first night were sending over files willy-nilly and excited about the speed within the transference and the comparison between your traditional tech and blockchain tech. So it was really nice to visualize that and have that as at least a case study. But the other thing is data breaches are a huge conversation in media, and a lot of people don't think about the root cause of the problem, and that really is insider attacks. So having this, so we all talk about decentralized environments, and you can almost think about it as an organization could be its own mini decentralized environment, which is kind of a weird thing to think about. But it's almost like publicizing it within the company. So you can think about it as more accountability and being able to track every user action. So you can go back and say, X user uploaded this much information, or archived and sent this information to this file system. And I think that kind of accountability and granularity within the actual user, rather than the centralized server servicing multiple companies and servicing all those transactions, can be pretty groundbreaking for the data security within the internal sense and not external sense, but that as well.
So you're describing a bit of a system so that the company can be, a control, let's say, big brother of all its files, because the main source of security breach is internal attack.
Exactly.
So how is some of the technology that you guys are developing applicable for supply chains
Right. So supply chain, I'm sorry, that was the product that Nate was talking about was deployed. That's specifically for change of hands, and think about like in-memory databases, everything, the most seamless connection, the most less complex data packet. That's what you aim for currently. That's as much as we can get. So that's the business benefit there, the amount of money that you save for a client, because they're getting that information faster. They're able to do more granular business intelligence on that to dictate their decision loops. That's something that we see a huge potential in blockchain, because it's making the gap smaller for the communication between all of the organizations, from the product, the supplier, to the actual end product.
Okay. So when we had a lot of talks about sustainable supply chains for sustainable applications, in the sense that, for example, there's a famous case from Walmart to track where the mangoes come from, and the fishing industry also has a need to be able to track the sources in the end, and then everything that happened in the process. For example, the containers where they're at, the temperature, and that was. So some of the products that you guys are building could be applicable, and you're leveraging Hyperledger to do some of these solutions. Is it something that, because I think that would be a very interesting way for a lot of the researchers here at the forestry school to interact with some of this technology. So would it be applicable to? Sure,
definitely. We implore people to build upon the network for these specific use cases. We would like to make sure that the space itself is growing for these use cases that make sense for the blockchain fundamentals. So the lack of market incentive, but more record of categorizing information and accessing that information. So definitely any kind of use case like that. You also have to think about the challenges, though, as you guys are looking into those projects. For instance, yeah, it could be a large data warehouse, but then where's the actual structuring of the data, or how are you querying specific information? What's the end user putting in to get the specific hash and get that actual transaction and pull that business intelligence? And that's where all of the newness comes from the platform. I think that's what's most exciting about this is we're all in it at a low level, and that means that we get to be a part of the design strategy and the implementation, and we get to work with the first users of this new technology.
Yeah. Through CBAY, this semester, Yale's hosting a workshop on sustainable supply chains, so it'd be great to have you. Victoria and Ellie are spearheading that. It'd be great to have you also visit that. Let's go back to the ecosystem. So you're using Hyperledger, and Kenzo, when you talked, you divided digital cash and digital vouchers and digital fuel. Another simple heuristic to divide the world of blockchains out there is through permissioned blockchains and permissionless blockchains. Hyperledger always fits within the permissioned blockchain. And there's a lot of tension sometimes about, well, you know, it doesn't have a proof of work model where everyone is part of the consensus. It has a different model, and you have to be part of the club to be part of access the data that's inside. And so sometimes people are like, well, isn't that the opposite of what blockchain's about? So I'd love for you guys to share a bit of a chat about this permission versus permissionless, and understanding for us what are each for, what are good for, and what are they bad for.
So when you're working with businesses, it gets really, really tricky. So I think most businesses out there, they really want to implement blockchain. Most of them do. You hear about it in the news all the time. And so when you're dealing with people's private information, you have to think about it from the perspective of, okay, I want this huge decentralized system, and with this decentralized system, we can have these miners, and they can contribute. All these developers can contribute to this network, and we can grow this network and make it huge. So that's really cool. That would be really neat for consumers to be able to contribute to a platform. So the idea of permission-based blockchains is not necessarily taking utility functions out of the blockchain. Like, some people think that if you're running a permission-based blockchain that there's no like utility token involved. That's actually not the case at all. So with a permission-based blockchain, it allows me to be like, okay, so I can give permissions to this business to own their own data. So while still carrying out the mission of blockchain, making what you own yours, all it's doing is that it's confining the rights to a business to be owned by that business, not to be seen or owned by anybody else. So it's bringing business privacy back to the organization that needs that privacy, rather than subjecting it to be visible by the every single peer that wants to be involved with the business. And even if there were to be more people that want to join that network, with a permission-based blockchain, you can just add peers. You can add permissions for those peers. So with the general mission of blockchain and with the inception of Bitcoin, we want to decentralize the world. I think that a lot of people are like, hey, let's decentralize everything. But there is a reasonable decentralization in my mind. So while it's really, really cool to think that we can just do it and make everything transparent and as transparently possible, we should be looking at it from the perspective of, we want to get this stuff adopted, we want to get this technology used, and the best way that we can get it to be used is by not interrupting business functions, but rather working with business functions. So if we were to, which by the way you can with Hyperledger Sawtooth, you can make a fully decentralized chain. You can totally do that. But if we were to do that, like if we were to put together another project, we're calling them net types. So every single network that we deploy, we have 2 more coming up. Every network that we deploy has different permissions, different reason for using it for different business use cases. So that way we can service businesses as a form of a product. If we were to take Hyperledger Sawtooth and make a decentralized platform out of it and then sell that to a business, then the argument for them would be, well, how do we get it so our customers don't see all of our information? And then the other argument is, okay, so in the grace of transparency, we all want to be transparent too, how can we make it so we know that this business is not doing fraudulent activity? Right. So the argument in that case would be, you have an internal auditor, or you would hire like a third-party auditor and give them permissions to the access of the network. Okay. So yeah. So you're structuring, you know, an open culture through pockets of closeness that are auditable,
so that those pockets can still operate.
Yeah, absolutely. So the fundamentals of how blockchain operates in the transparency value of blockchain, that is not being taken away at all. So all it is that you're confining the data to who owns it. And with Slide Drive in general, Slide Drive is a dApp that's built on top of our blockchain network. So by doing that, we can give that privacy and that value to the consumer as well. So I'm sure that for all of you that store really personal information, files, whatever it be, you don't want everybody to see it. Not in all cases, at least, unless you're sharing it with family and friends and stuff like that. But for the most part, I mean, me at least, I would not want all of my data to be seen by the world. And it's important to note that if you were to use a fully decentralized blockchain, then you would be subjecting yourself to that problem. So.
Yeah. We had a Hyperledger workshop early in the summer, and Marta, who's the director of ecosystem at Hyperledger, gave us a talk, and she specifically said, "Look, blockchains are not to store your data on because you want to make sure that you ensure privacy."
Yeah.
So I think you're alluring to that. Kenzo, do you have anything to add in terms of heuristics for us to navigate the world of permission and permissionless blockchains?
I don't have much to add. I think that was great. I think it's worth noting that, just to piggyback on what both of these two said, a publicly traded cybersecurity firm is like they've estimated that 53% of cyber attacks are from inside. It's like insane. 53%. You could flip a coin, right? And you could say it was probably, literally, it was probably someone in the firm. I mean, it's nuts. We're talking about like major breaches. So
that
it's
happens with countries too.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, whistleblowers it's wild. So, I don't really have much to add to that, but I think it's just worth underscoring. I mean, if you're not familiar with that statistic, that 53% of like a corporation's just in regards to the threat vector, the size of the threat vector is 53%. It'd be over half the pie chart.
So in many ways, we're talking about the use of blockchain for monitoring all the transactions inside that specific pocket. Kenzo, back to you. You are going to give the 201 workshop hands-on. Sure. And for those a bit more advanced in coding and blockchain, and you want to talk about Stellar, which is something that we're hearing a lot of excitement about. I've talked about this with you as well, Nathan. Can you tell us a bit about Stellar? What's it for? Why should we be excited about, but why should we be worried about any hypes?
Well, I think Jed McCaleb, the guy who he's integral in the construction of Ripple, back in 2004, that guy's a genius. If you look at his blog, that guy is a fucking genius. That's why you should be excited about Stellar. But aside from that, it's got extraordinarily high network throughput, relatively speaking, not versus say Visa, which is canonical point of reference for some reason, but versus say Bitcoin or Ethereum, just because they have so much traffic in their network. I think it's pretty cheap. It's relatively cheap to process a transaction on Stellar. That's why it's really exciting. A big drawback, though, is the fact that it's just like Bitcoin script. I mean, the scripting language, which happens to be called script colloquially, is it's not Turing complete. So, yep.
What is Stellar mostly useful for? I mean, each blockchain, it turns that each specific ecosystem has a specific use case of itself. We talked about use cases of blockchain, but then each ecosystem is useful for something, not so great for something else. And I think you were talking a bit about Hyperledger and how it can be useful for producing these permission pockets. You talked about what Bitcoin is also useful. What should we expect from Stellar?
So I think we had some Cardano folks over at Byte a couple months ago, maybe. Yeah, I don't know where Rack or Emily are, but we had some Cardano devs over, and it was really interesting. They're once in a while for anyone who cares, you run into a functional guy who's a guy or girl who's really into functional programming, and they'll say things like, well, the lack of iteration behavior, the fact that everything has to be recursive, is nice because you don't necessarily need say halting functionality, which is kind of the core, that is the core of Turing completeness. Basically having a program knowing when to stop just arbitrarily speaking. But when it comes to Stellar, I think like you can do a lot with, technically speaking, you can do a lot with the stack machine. I know that's probably a little esoteric, but I think that you can do a lot of really cool stuff with the stack machine. And I think when it comes to Stellar, just the combination of an exciting project with really smart people behind it, and I think that they're doing it for not to be like the right reasons. I'm not like the arbiter of like the right reasons to do something, but I just think that, that's a really exciting project just in general.
Stellar Structures is as a great platform for payment architectures.
Sure.
So would it be logical to say that it's particularly useful for fintech applications? Because I know Byte Academy specifically does a lot of teaching through you also in fintech. Is that a bit of also the overlap where you have with Stellar is financial transactions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're pretty agnostic. Like, at the end of the day, I'm personally a big fan of Bitcoin and Ethereum. I think they're both cool in their own ways. I think the most exciting thing about Bitcoin is just the novelty. I think at the end of the day, if you read some of the stuff, like it's kind of weird to think, in the systematization of knowledge, it's a weird phrase, but they talk about how the only documentation when it comes to Bitcoin is really like, there's the white paper and then there's just the source code. And you have this kind of like meme, for lack of a better word, in the blockchain community where it's like you have something that's it works practically, but theoretically it doesn't work, so to speak, because it's not like formally verified or something like that. So I think just that's what excites me about Bitcoin is just kind of like reading all those papers from all these really smart folks, kind of digging down in that source code and getting their hands dirty. But what's really exciting about Ethereum in particular, again, is like the community and then the just Solidity. Solidity is cool as fuck. Like, seriously, if you dive into Solidity, it's actually pretty cool. I fucking hate JavaScript. Oh my god,
Isn't it fun?
Yeah, I mean, I hate that shit, and somehow like this JavaScript like language, Solidity is, I'm really excited by it. So anyway, yeah,
great.
I'm pretty agnostic.
Well, I'd love to see if any of us have anything else to share about it. And other than that, it'd be great to get some questions from the audience. Do you have any running mics ready? Yes, we have a question over there.
Hi, I have a question regarding supply chains and blockchain application. So there is a benefit for other actors down the supply chain to have their own data. But on the other hand, a lot of people who are, especially in the downstream supply chains, they are not really good with the technology. So whatever data they input on blockchain, this will be recorded just as it is. So have you looked into this issue, and what is the corporate approach to resolving this?
So, you want to take this one?
All right, so what you're saying, I like to reframe the question so I make sure that I'm answering your question. You want it to be more business as usual. They have their own naming conventions, their own record as a method to record all that information. They use, let's say, SAP or something. You're trying to ask exactly how do we fit in? How is it duplicating that data, or is it instead of? Is that what you're asking? Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. I think it is important to understand that you're not going to get everyone to migrate to this instead of theory or perception of blockchain. I think it's important to use it as, for first and foremost, communication and auditing. So you would be porting over that information. So it would be more like, how can we use their existing naming conventions and work with the clients in-house to design their specific voting contracts so that they can push out those transactions to communicate with specific people within their own network. That's what we're working on currently.
A follow-up to that, so a lot of it sounds like you're working on a lot of the core technology, and there's a question about like supply chain. It requires a lot of making it. Are you working with any other parties that are able to work directly with a specific application for a supply chain?
So like in a consortium?
Well, more like someone that says, like, here's your core technology, but the company says, here's my problem. Do you guys solve produce the supply chain sort of ecosystem for that company, or you need someone else to understand both sides of the?
You sure?
Because every supply chain is a world on its own.
Different. Yeah. So what we do right now as a process is we will have like an inquiry, and then we will try to custom fit that specific need for that client. So for instance, if say hypothetically I am a person that wants to use what we're calling the network is Aster. So we want to use Scroll Aster for our supply chain solution. And party A, for instance, has all of these necessities that they need to do, and then the second party, they have different needs. So the reason why we're coming out with essentially these templates for blockchain is, and along with like one big network, is one, so that way we can make something custom for whatever client needs to be serviced, and two, so that way we're not forcing clients to work off of one specific privileged network. So if we were to force, and this is why Ethereum is having such a hard time being adopted by businesses. So if we wanted to take a bunch of these enterprise clients and we wanted to force them onto one blockchain, they would all have to work their business practices around all of the requirements of that blockchain. So what we're doing is we're essentially custom fitting it to fit the needs of every individual client. That being said, yes, we are deploying a lot of blockchains. This is not just one blockchain, it's just one template that we're using in the process of many in the future.
So you're working on a very modular approach as well.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? We have two up in the front. We have the mic coming up.
Are these blockchains siloed or completely separate?
They would be completely separate, unless it's like one large consortium. So if we, so sometimes with a supply chain client, they might come to us and be like, okay, so this process needs to fit everybody involved in our process. So in that case, we would create one blockchain around the entire consortium process of their needs, and then it would fit what they would want for their process. So they're not necessarily siloed, they're more individual.
And can one make changes or?
Yes.
Okay.
So if it were to be a consortium, we would make the individuals that are parts of that are significant parts of those decision-making processes, we would make them verified peers. So in our white paper, we talk about a peer-to-verified peer consensus or proof of verification. So we would give those individuals the rights to make those changes, like if there were to be a hard fork or something like that. That would be contingent upon the voting privileges and restrictions that those verified individuals would need. So,
is that how the internal cybersecurity is designed?
yes.
Okay.